I'm Fritz Mayer. I'm the Dean of the Korbel School. Delighted to welcome you here in the room and I guess online as well to a discussion on the connection between democratic quality and corruption control. The session today is part of the C Center's program on responsible engagement, funded by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. So thanks to the C Center and to the Carnegie Corporation, and really part of the Korbel School's larger focus on democratic governance, as evidenced by our Denver Democracy Summit last week. For today's topic, we really couldn't ask for better discussants. József Péter Martin is the Executive Director of Transparency International Hungary and the Senior Lecturer at Corvinus University. Transparency International is really the leading international NGO working on issues of corruption around the world, and Hungary is in many ways the front line of the myriad challenges to democracy. Once one of the most democratic countries in Central and Eastern Europe, now much less so. And on a personal note, I have family in Hungary, so I've followed these developments over a period of time. So I have a strong personal interest in hearing today's conversation. And in conversation with József today is our own Professor Rachel Epstein, Senior Associate Dean as well, who is one of the world's leading scholars of Eastern Europe and of democracy. So I'm going to step back and turn the proceedings over to Rachel, and like you, very much look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Fritz. And welcome, József. We're delighted to have you here. Thank you for making the trip. In the middle, or at what we hope is the end of a pandemic. I hope this is the end of it. I'm glad you made it. He was supposed to come in week 3, and he's here now instead, so we're delighted that you're here. I also want to thank a few other people. First of all, I want to thank Deborah Avant, who's sitting right here. She is the mastermind behind the current grant from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, which is focused on responsible engagement. We've got many people also from the class, of which József is a part this quarter, on understanding how, in the context of research, we can apply our research productively and undertake constructive interventions as opposed to ones that backfire. So that's partly what the Responsible Engagement Grant is about. I also want to thank Gergana Kostadinova, who is the program manager at the C Center, has done an incredible job of organizing this event, but also organizing József's visit more generally, and just in general doing a wonderful job executing on that grant. And I want to thank the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support of this project. So we're here today. Fritz mentioned at the outset that democratic erosion around the world is an ongoing phenomenon, has been ongoing, some people think, for the last 10 to 16 years, depending on how you're measuring it. And Hungary is a particularly important case because it's a member of the European Union. And before a country joins the European Union, they have to demonstrate very strong democratic credentials and political commitment to democratic governance. So I think by way of introducing the topic, József, it would be helpful to hear from you, both in your capacity at Transparency International Hungary, but also as a citizen of Hungary. What is the situation with regard to democratic governance in Hungary today? Where did you start in the early 2000s, or if you want to start in 2010, where have we ended up?
Well, thank you very much, Rachel, and I would like to thank again for the invitation, and I would like to thank the great hospitality that I experience in these days while I am here in Denver. So yes, I think this discussion is very, very timely because Hungary has been going through a very steep democratic backsliding in the past more than decade now. So even in some aspects, not all, but some aspects, this backsliding it dates to longer term than that. So Hungary was once a forerunner of the Central and Eastern European countries, as it was mentioned by Professor Fritz Mayer just now. So, and from the eminent pupil among the Central and Eastern European countries, Hungary has become the laggard at least when it comes to rule of law and democratic backsliding, including a very specific and systemic form of corruption. So this is a very sad phenomenon, and Rachel, you asked this question from me not only as director of Transparency International Hungary, but also as a citizen. So I can say that as a citizen, it's really a deeply sad phenomenon, what has been going on in Hungary in the past decade. All the assessments and all the analysis show that independent analysis, of course, not the analysis of the government, that show that Hungary is not anymore a democracy. So not anymore, at least a liberal democracy. We call the regime as a hybrid regime, so somewhere between liberal democracies and dictatorship. In other words, we can say that Hungary, the Hungarian system led by Viktor Orbán, who assumed the power in 2010, well, he was back in 1998 also once the prime minister 4 years, but back then he didn't destroy the democratic institutions. From 2010, he did so, and he constructed a regime. I think this word illiberal regime, which he was referring to, this is quite an understatement, because I don't really think that illiberal democracy as such can exist. So if a democracy is properly working, it should be to some extent, or to a great extent, should be a liberal democracy. So basically, he reshuffled the whole institutional system and reshuffled the state function. And I am quite proud, although this proudness is controversial, but that Transparency International Hungary was the first who stated back in 2012 that the Hungarian state is captured. So for a long time afterwards, there were no stakeholders who would put up this notion or this label. But then by now it's treated as a commonplace in Hungary that the state is captured. So we have unfortunately a captured state, which basically means that the institutions serve the government interests, serve the interests of the elite close to the government, let there be politicians or businessmen or oligarchs, and do not serve enough the interests of people, do not serve the public good. So that's why I believe we cannot speak anymore of a Western type democracy, but we can speak of a hybrid regime. From other point of view, or to use another method to make it understandable what's going on in Hungary, I would say that the Hungarian system is somewhere between Berlusconi's Italy and Putin's Russia. So, somewhere in between, and the very fact that paradigmatically is very close to the Russian system, although still milder in terms of human rights, for example. It's in terms of individual rights, it's still considerably milder than the Putin system. but it's a clear deviation from the EU mainstream. A clear deviation. In many respects, Hungary is an outlier inside the EU. For example, if we speak about the nature of corruption, which has become extremely centralized in Hungary, then in this respect, Hungary clearly an outlier in European Union.
Mm-hmm. So speaking of democratic erosion, one of the focuses that we're really paying attention to in the course that you're helping me teach this quarter is the role of media in securing democratic quality. Again, from your perspective at Transparency International, but also from a citizen's perspective, what's happened to the independent media, and how do you think it's affecting the ways in which people behave at the polls, if it is? And to what extent, you okay? Do you want some water? To what extent do you feel pressure to not expose government abuses of power in your role? And how do other journalists feel in the Hungarian context?
Yeah. So perhaps in this circle it was not yet mentioned that in my previous life I was journalist. I was even editor of then independent economic magazine, and by now it is entirely captured by the government and transmits the government propaganda. And of course, it's a very sad story how the Hungarian media was transformed, and it has been a long-standing process. I would start somewhere in the 90s, when the Hungarian media, according to a well-known Hungarian scholar, was characterized. So in the first, not only in the 90s, in the first 20 years of the proper democracy, it was characterized by the multi-party colonization or colonizations, or attempt towards a multi-party colonization, which means that the media was free, at least much more free than today, but still the influence from the parties, from different parties, the political scene back then was much more pluralistic than nowadays. So the parties still had an impact and the politics had an impact to the life of journalists. But still, you could do an independent and unbiased journal. I believe that what I, in the journal or in the newspaper where I was editor-in-chief, I believe that we did an independent job, and we kept the same distance from all the sides. And then happened 2010, and in 2010 this attempt of multi-party colonization transformed into a blunt, not only attempt, but practice of one-party colonization. So basically the aim of the governing elite and of the governing party, which is called Fidesz, the aim was to capture the media in several steps. So the first step was to transform the state media. Beforehand we called it public media, but we don't call it, the government critical persons, they don't call it anymore public media in Hungary. We call it state media because it transmits only the government messages. As I said, the Hungarian regime is a hybrid regime, which means it's not a democracy, but also not a dictatorship itself. But in this very respect, as the state media functions, it's very close to a dictatorship media. So it's really a pure propaganda. I think it's not an overstatement. It is the sad reality that the state media transmits only the pro-government, only the news which are favorable for the governments. But that was only the first step. Then came the other steps which were like more sophisticated, if I may use this word in this sense, which were basically a very strong market capture. So it was not only enough for the governing elite to capture the state media, but also they wanted to penetrate into the private media. And they reached this via two interlinking methods. So the first method was the capture of regulation via media law and other kind of regulation, favoring the incumbent governing party and favoring also the pro-government voices. And the second was that it enabled for government close businessmen and oligarchs to buy themselves into the market. This process has been going on since 2010, but I would say that in the first 5 years of this government, it was not so dramatic as afterwards. The first the first black year of media freedom in Hungary was 2016, when dozens of media outlets lost their independence. Either they switched sides because they were bought up by these government oligarchs, or they ceased to exist, simply. So, for example, the largest daily paper, Népszabadság, which was oppositional, left-wing paper, it had to shut down because of government maneuvers. But these maneuvers that's why I use the word sophisticated. These maneuvers, in most of the cases, are indirect maneuvers. So not like in a dictatorship, okay, then you make a law and then you shut down the paper. But you ask, and in this case, they asked an Austrian businessman, not even a Hungarian, to buy up the newspaper. And this Austrian businessman, after a while, after lots of maneuvering, shut down or closed the paper. But lots of other papers had to close as well. And another black year was 2018, when a totally unique conglomerate emerged, which is, I believe, what we call, with lots of militia in Hungary, Hungaricum. So it is called Central European Media and Press Foundation. This is a nominally private foundation, but owned or controlled by a government crony. And this foundation basically controls 500 titles. You heard it correctly, 500 titles. So it's an extreme centralization of the media. And I should say that most of, if not all, most of 500 titles, they also transmit this government propaganda. So basically in these outlets, we can speak of pure censorship. So if you have different opinion, you cannot publish pieces. So that's what happened in 2018. And if we observe the market today, then we can detect quite big differences across the segments of the media. So according to some studies, the radio market and the print market is almost entirely captured. So if we look at the leadership and the business results, then we can say that around 80% of these segments are captured by the government. In TVs, the situation is somewhat better, but only somewhat. 50–60% is captured. We have still one very strong independent TV station. This is the RTL Club, which is owned by the German Bertelsmann Group and which is still on. And well, it is still independent. And the segment in which the media is the most free is the internet segment, so the online portal segment. We have at least 4 or 5 big online portals, and that are the main sources of information for those who want independent and unbiased news. So in the internet segment, the capture rate is like 30–40%. And the rest is free, and that is the nature of the Hungarian press market, is that these so-called pure players, so those portals which do not have the print background, these have become over years and over decades, due to the specific features of the Hungarian media transformation, not of the political side, but of the digital transformation. These have become the most important sources of information, at least compared to the print press. So the print has marginalized and or captured by the government interest, and these news portals still can be first accessed, and second still can produce independent reporting and news. So having said that, I would say that the media situation is far from being satisfactory. According to Freedom House Press Freedom Index, the Hungarian media is not anymore free, but it's only partly free. That's their label. And by the way, this is very much in connection with the corruption, backsliding, and obviously in connection with democratic backsliding as well.
So that's a depressing picture, and it has to affect the way people behave at the polls. So you've got elections coming up in April. Given the lock that the government has on the information environment, how can Hungary get out of it? I mean, right, you have an opposition candidate, you have a series of parties that have come together in a coalition to oppose Fidesz, but very little of the media is going to try to provide coverage of both sides. So what are the prospects for the elections coming up? It sounds like the internet, the digital platforms give the most promise of independence. Is there a way to enlarge their reach in Hungary?
Yes, it's certainly a very timely and very topical question. Ahead of the elections, we will have elections on 3rd of April, so in less than 7 weeks from now. And I would say that the elections cannot be fair based on these circumstances that I described. So that's the nature or the characteristic feature of the Hungarian hybrid regime, that the level playing field is extremely distorted towards the government close stakeholders in the media and beyond the media. So because of that, and because of the distortions in campaign financing, for example, we can exclude that the elections could be fair. Whether there will be free, it is well, we will see. By the freedom of election, I mean if there is no systemic or occasional electoral fraud. So back in 2018 and 2014, when we had the previous two elections, certainly there were some electoral frauds, but these were rather occasional, and the OSCE, which back then sent a limited scope mission to Hungary, labeled, well, I do not like that they labeled that, but that's for the substance, free but not fair elections. Well, they did label it in 2014. In 2018, they didn't label it as such, but that was the substance, that free but not fair. But even the freedom of election could be questioned as well. Now the situation will change in that respect, that the OSCE, and this is a very recent development, we send a full mission to Hungary, which happens for the second time in the history of the European Union countries. Because once it was sent, this full mission was sent to Bulgaria, and this is the second time. This might have a kind of deterrent effect to election frauds, but if you speak with independent observers and election experts, unfortunately we cannot exclude the election fraud either entirely. But what we can say for sure is that the elections cannot be fair, because most of the media, as I described, and the campaign financing, and also the unilaterally modified electoral law with some gerrymandering and other tricks in the cards. So they all favor the government. So the playing field is very much tilted, and that's why it is extremely difficult for the opposition to perform under these circumstances. Having said that, as the polls are now, we have two big blocks. We have the Fidesz party and we have the united opposition. Well, by united, we mean that this is a coalition of 6 parties. I wouldn't say that there is no contradictions and fractures among these 6 parties, but still they recognized that under this election law, which Fidesz changed unilaterally, they have to unite, because otherwise they lose in each and every constituency. And if they lose in each and every constituency, we have altogether 198 seats in the parliament, and out of that 198, 106 are distributed according to constituencies. So if that is pure mathematics, if the opposition is fragmented, then in each constituency, Fidesz wins, or in most. So that's why they had to unite. They had to unite, and now we have this united opposition and Fidesz, the 2 big blocks. And yesterday there was an opinion poll, and Fidesz, among those voters who would like to vote, Fidesz is leading by 3 percentage points, which is well within the margin. So I would say that the opposition has more chances than any time before in the past 12 years. But still, if I am realistic, well, these chances are limited. These chances are limited. Beyond these 2 blocks, there are some smaller parties. And there are suspicions that some of these smaller parties are encouraged by Fidesz, in order to devise the opposition. This is the phenomenon which we call business party phenomenon. This is very interesting, both from, well, very interesting and depressing also, both from political point of view, but also from corruption point of view, because these parties basically are formed just before the elections, extract enormous money from the well, enormous, I mean, for persons who run this party, enormous money from the state budget, and then disappear. Then disappear without proper accountability. But politically, it can be dangerous also as for the opposition, because the opposition voters can be divided. Yeah, so that's in a nutshell about the chances of the elections.
So it's reassuring to hear that the margin is quite small in polling, but I guess the other question that comes up in light of the corruption that your organization exposes, the state of the media, how well understood among the population in Hungary is the regime's corruption, their media takeover, their malfeasance in general, the ways in which their conduct contradicts the principles of the European Union, of which they became a member in 2004. I mean, is knowledge about how this regime conducts itself well known? Is it well dispersed, or are people, is the information environment really restricting how well informed people are when they go to the polls in April or at any other time?
Yeah, so certainly this media capture plays a big role. So when I say that the elections cannot be fair, I was referring mainly to this media distortions. If we see or if we observe the attitudes of the Hungarians vis-à-vis corruption, this is full of paradoxes, I should say, because despite the media capture, which is quite surprising, is that the awareness of the serious corruption situation is quite high. So according to Corruption Barometer, which is a survey of Transparency International, and a country cross survey, and according to Eurobarometer surveys as well, 70–80% of the Hungarians think that corruption, including state corruption, is a big problem in the country. So we have this on one side. What we have on the other side is that Hungarians are very, most of the Hungarians tolerate, unfortunately, corruption. And that comes out also from a Eurobarometer survey that was conducted in 2020. Only 38% of the Hungarians say that corruption cannot be tolerated. 62% say that it can be tolerated. This is an extreme number within the European Union. So this tolerance index is the highest across all the countries of the European Union. So we have on the one hand awareness, a kind of awareness, of course, within limitations, and on the other hand we have this tolerance. And well, the social scientists and observers and NGO people, including myself, we have been searching for the explanations of this contradiction. So one, and there are probably several. So there is no one cause, obviously, like always in social sciences, but there are several arguments or causes for it. So one obvious cause is that this is the media capture. So despite that most of people have access to internet, and the internet segment is relatively free, there are still lots of people who just see the news still of the state media. And if you see the news of the state media, you see no corruption at all. I mean, you see corruption in other countries, mostly in Western countries, and in Ukraine. But you don't see corruption in Hungary, in Russia, in Turkey. You see that the situation is cannot be better than that. So that still certainly plays a role, even if potentially these very people could access or most of them, the internet penetration is quite high, could access potential internet, but for some reason they do not. So the government propaganda is so strong that they are flooded they flood with the posters, the streets in the countries, that there is simply this effect of manipulating the people, if I may use this word, brainwashing the heads of people. So that certainly plays a big role in this kind of apathy. Other factors of this apathy can be that, according to empirical studies and even theories, I would refer here to a study of Darren Ecemoglu from 2013. So competitive corruption is perceived by people as more. So they think that competitive corruption is worse than the centralized kind of corruption, because they see it much more competitive corruption in front of their eyes. There are more channels of corruption, and it's more visible. It's more visible. So if the corruption is democratic, it is more visible than if the corruption is extremely centralized. What is the Hungarian case? Another explanation can be that the society, the politics and the society in Hungary is extremely polarized. So it's comparable with the US polarization, I think, and it's not comparable with any of the EU countries' polarization. And the government plays these cards. So in my view, one of the biggest sins of this government was or have been is that they have constantly playing this card of polarization, and they extremely polarized the society. But how does it come to this? To your question, Rachel, it comes to this because Fidesz much of Fidesz voters simply do not perceive corruption what we perceive as corruption. So they think that the blunt money transfer from state budget to cronies, undermining any principles of rule of law, it is just a legitimate process. So they do not consider it as corruption. So when we speak of corruption in Hungary, we do not speak only or primarily about the traditional forms of corruption, of bribery, of kickbacks, but we speak of this undue transfer of resources to a new ownership class, undermining the rule of law. So that can be another explanation. Another explanation can be that lots of people might think that that Hungary and or the politicians are per se corrupt. So there is this generalized views that the political elite is corrupt everywhere, so nothing to see here, basically. Another explanation can be that the methods of corruption in connection with this extensive money transfers are very sophisticated. So in your class, several weeks ago, we discussed about an obscure scheme of golden visas. And this is how not the golden visa scheme in itself, because it can be even transparent. But in the Hungarian case, it's not at all transparent. This is a government-led, government-induced corruption channel, but it is constructed very, very sophisticatedly. There are these intermediary companies which should not be there in a normal golden visa scheme. And these kind of schemes are very hardly understandable by the people. And last but not least, I would mention the economic aspect. So Hungary is not a post-materialistic society. So the post-materialistic silent evolution, to cite Englehart's work, it is not going on in Hungary. So Hungary is a very much materialistic society. And lots of people could observe that their economic situation, purely materialistic economic situation, purely the standard of living, has been improving in recent years, or at least until the pandemic. So there were substantial growth between 2013 and 2020. But those very people, and the real income increase was approximately 30%. But those very people might not recognize that the growth or the real income increase would have been even much more without corruption, and they would not recognize that our peers have developed much more than we did in Central and Eastern Europe. So Hungary has stuck in the middle income trap. And despite this 4-5% in average yearly growth, Hungary could not approach from the laggards, could not leave behind the laggards of the region, and still part of those countries, including we are ahead only of Romania, Bulgaria, and Croatia, and same level approximately with Poland. So if we see it in a longer time series, there is no substantial development, but that's only the GDP. What is even more worrisome is the long-term growth of the economy. Because all the big aspects of sustainable growth, of inclusive growth, of competitiveness, such as education, healthcare, innovation capacity, they are all in very, very bad state. Much worse state than the overall GDP figures would suggest.
Mm-hmm. Good, thank you. So in a minute, I'm going to take questions from the audience, but I have to ask one more question not because you raised it, because it's going on. And I know you're not an international security expert per se, but you do live in Hungary, and there's an enormous crisis looming between Russia and Ukraine and neighboring countries. And I think this gets back to public perceptions and how puzzling it is from the outside, because Orbán has developed a very close relationship with Putin. There's a strong, at least economic connection there around energy supplies. But given the way other post-communist countries, particularly thinking of Poland and the Baltic states, view Russia and Putin, and their reluctance to embrace Putin, even if in Poland we also have an authoritarian leading government, they are not like Orbán embracing Putin and his authoritarian ways in the same manner. So with regard to the Ukrainian crisis, how is that playing out on the Hungarian political stage, and how are people in Hungary viewing Putin's conduct vis-a-vis Ukraine? And is it going to have an effect, I guess, on the election would be the other question.
So it's easier to answer the second question. I don't think it will have an effect anyhow to the upcoming elections in Hungary. But the views are very polarized, so which might not be a surprise for you after what I've said about the general polarization of the society. The government press and the government media transmits news which basically have constantly bashing of Ukraine. So there is that this is really they depict a very, very distorted picture about Ukraine. And on the other hand, this very media is very, very friendly with Russia and with President Putin. So meanwhile, the independent and the opposition media, basically in line with the mainstream Western media, so has a very critical stance towards Putin and towards his regime, including the possible invasion of Ukraine. There are several experts in Hungary. I'm not an Ukrainian, an expert on Ukraine, but there are several experts who still think that an independent expert, I mean, because the government experts, they say what the government says. I mean, they do not have autonomy, not 2% either. So, some independent experts still say that the war is indeed can be avoided, and perhaps the development of the last days, I mean, of yesterday, for example, that can prove or that can strengthen this argument. But of course, we don't know what will happen. There are some rumors sometimes, and sometimes it is reflected in the independent press as well, that Orbán would like to use the Ukrainian situation and the possible destabilization of Ukraine in order to increase the influence in Carpathia. So this is a region where there are minority ethnic Hungarians. For sure, it's not a official government stance. So I haven't seen any government press release, government communication that they would want so. But there are rumors like that. And of course, needless to say that any kind of attempt of destabilization of the society, of Ukraine and of the whole region, it is extremely dangerous, in my opinion, for Hungary. So that is it's quite clear. On the other hand, what I see, the official stance of the government, transmitted by the government propaganda, it is that they bash very strongly Ukraine, but they do not. So they take a more moderate approach vis-à-vis the West, which is in a way understandable because Hungary is still part of the EU and part of the NATO. So it would be the communication goes rather against Ukraine than against the NATO and against the West. And the communication is also very much pro Putin. But overall, I think that it will not play a role in the Hungarian election. It is another proof or another test for Orbán until when he can pursue this maneuvering, being in a nominally high standard institutions such as EU and NATO, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, undermining the values and even the policies of the EU and NATO, and that's obviously a very striking paradox, and the big question is until when he can do that. But in the Ukrainian conflict, it also can be observed that that he is trying to maneuver between the two sides.
Good, thank you. Okay, are there any, I hope we have some questions from the audience. We also, I think we have some people on Zoom, and if there are people on Zoom who have questions, I'm happy to take them up here on a note card if that's easier, but please let us know if you have questions for József. Yes, please. Go ahead. Yeah, do you want to stand up? It might be easier for us to hear you.
So I can't hear you.
Do you want to just take off your mask for a sec? Is that okay? Yeah. We can hear you better. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great questions.
Thank you very much. Very good questions. So the first, the turnover rate in Hungarian elections is usually is quite high. So this, for some reasons, this apathy vis-à-vis corruption, it does not turn to an apathy vis-à-vis elections. It is, I would explain that also by the polarization effect. So to quote a Hungarian scholar, we live in a cold civil war. So, and in a cold civil war, both sides are mobilized, at least in order to, and at least for elections. So last time's turnover was around 70%, and well, it depends if you consider it high or high or not. But in some European countries, it's much lower. It's I think it's for a Central and Eastern European standard, it's not bad. So 70%, and I expect basically approximately the same for the upcoming elections. There were some elections in the past when it was less, but it was never for the national elections, it was never less, I think, than 60%. So there is no much, despite the apathy and despite the whole, despite the problems that I raised, there is no problem with the turnover rate. On the other hand, it comes up from time to time in the opposition side that if the elections are not fair, which is for sure, and questionably free, which is also true, whether they should assist, they should take part in the elections or not. So, but so far, the opposition has always decided to participate in the elections and not to boycott the election. The question on the EU is, of course, a very good question and timely question, but a very complex one. So first of all, my first statement is that if Hungary was not in the EU, the situation would have been much worse. That's my first point and take on that. So the situation would be much more comparable to Russia or Turkey, and so that is because afterwards I will criticize the EU. So it's as a first point, it's good to underline that without the EU membership, which is by the way supported by the large majority of the population, paradoxically enough, Hungary is full of paradoxes, paradoxically enough, by lots of Fidesz voters as well. So 85% is the supporting rate of the EU. So the EU membership is a big asset for democracy, the remaining part of democracy, and big asset for the development of the country. So that is first point. The second point is that, unfortunately, for a number of years, the EU simply turned a blind eye on corruption, this systemic or centralized form of corruption, and also the systematic breach of rule of law. That does not mean that in communication the EU didn't release some statements that we are concerned about the whatever state of democracy. In brackets in Twitter there is a page, the EU is concerned, where kind of satirical or ironical page. So the EU has been concerned for many years, but absolutely nothing happened. Absolutely nothing happened, and this changed basically in the last 1-2 years. And now this seemingly the EU starts to take it seriously. The Hungarian case as well as the Polish case. The two cases have lots of similarities, but also some differences, not only concerning the Ukrainian or the Russian situation, but also concerning of corruption, because in Hungary the corruption is much bigger problem than in Poland. Meanwhile, the rule of law backsliding is a huge problem in both countries. So in the past several months or years, 1 or 2 years, the EU recognized that they should do something, and what they could do, should do, or will do. So first is that in the first time in the history of the membership of these Central and Eastern European countries, the EU has suspended the so-called reconstruction fund as much as 7 billion euros. This is just for Hungary. 7 billion euros, referring to the insufficient performance of anti-corruption framework and rule of law performance. It happened last year, and first or second quarter of last year, and it is still not released, these funds. So this is the first tangible measure of the EU that the EU did against the systemic corruption. Before that, there was no such suspension, or if there were suspension, only in a very tiny, only very tiny sums were suspended, and then they were released after a very short period of time. So that is the first. The second is the so-called conditionality or rule of law mechanism, which basically links the rule of law issues with the money funneling. So the idea is, which we on behalf of Transparency International have been promoting for many years on European level as well. The idea is that those countries which do not comply with the rule of law standards, those countries cannot get the EU funds. So the idea is very good. The problem is that it has come too late, and the procedure seems to be very lengthy. But after yesterday's court decision, in which court decision the EU and the Hungarian and the Polish appeal was rejected by the European Court of Justice. So this is yesterday's news. So most probably this rule of law mechanism will start against Hungary and Poland. That's another thing, that by the time it reaches the sanctions, it will be like 8-9 months from now. But still, it's better than
Than just being concerned.
Than only being concerned. All in all, I strongly think that I have been in this opinion for many, many years, that the only way that could at least that would stop or at least reduce the rule of law backsliding is the financial sanctions. So the EU can produce tons of rule of law reports, which they do, by the way, but nothing will happen if there are no financial sanctions. To put it, I simplify a little bit, but that's for the sake of understanding. But I think that's the way how somehow this process perhaps can be stopped. But there are lots of course there are lots of question marks here as well. So returning to your question, the EU now takes it really seriously, and if the rule of law mechanism is launched, and if there are some funds that are suspended, that might harm this government. That's another issue, whether they will harm the population as well. So that's another complex question, but I will not start now because that was not your question. So thank you again for the question.
Thanks a lot. Other questions? Yes, Sabina.
Uh-huh. Mm. Mm-hmm.
So do you see anything that the European Union could potentially do to reverse this apathy, maybe in addition to sanctions the government?
Yeah, again, very good questions. Thank you very much. The first is the harder question. I think it's very hard actually to predict what these sanctions or fines could produce, because there is such kind of thinking, and I think one reason why the EU has been so reluctant so far, it was that there are many reasons for that, but one reason is that they thought that it might backfire. So if they punish, then it might backfire. It might not improve the situation, but it might induce or encourage these autocratic leaders to pull out the countries from the EU, for example. If you say that in Romania and Bulgaria the fines did not, or we have fines now in Poland as well, so did not improve the situation, that's of course an alarming sign, and it's very hard to overcome this situation. What I would do, and I said it also to EU policymakers and to embassy people in Hungary, what I would do on behalf of EU is to approach this on policy level, and this links to your second question, is that not punishing or not suspending the funds per se, but to link it to some concrete achievements. So, for example, saying that, okay, you need to introduce a new conflict of interest legislation, or you have to introduce a new whistleblowing legislation, or you have to introduce a new public procurement system. And but not only the legislation, because legislation is in Eastern Europe is just half or quarter success, but if we are persuaded that it works well, then you get the fund. And so, sorry to say, but this stick and carrot approach, it might work, I think, much more efficiently than just to fine. So just to suspend the fine. There is another aspect of fines which might be controversial. In one of the cases, paradigmatic cases, which at your course, Rachel, was discussed last week, this Ilios case in which family members of Prime Minister Orbán were involved as well, and which was investigated extensively by the Anti-Fraud Office of the European Union, or by Olaf. And at the end of the day, the European Commission levied fines to Hungary, but the problem was that it is paid by the Hungarian taxpayers' money. So one could say that Hungary is punished, or the Hungarian population is punished twice. First, because of the corruption of the elite. Secondly, because they paid, or the taxpayers or the public pay the fines. So there are lots of controversies in this respect as well. But positively speaking, if they could link on policy level the very concrete results and achievements and the funds, I think that might have end in good results. And what concrete things could be? For example, a new whistleblower regulation. Sometimes in Hungary, the whistleblowers themselves are intimidated and punished, and not the corrupt perpetrators. So a new whistleblowing regulation, the conflict of interest regulation is also a total mess. A better control of EU funds distribution, better control of public procurement. There the regulation is more or less in line with the EU, but the problem is the implementation, the execution. Public procurement, really the hotbed of this systemic corruption, which basically channels the public money in huge quantity towards the government cronies. 40% of the public procurement procedures are single bidding procedures, so there is no competition in almost half of the public procurement procedures, and including the EU funds, because half of public procurement, 50–60% of public procurement are covered by the EU funds. So this could be the concrete results. So the more the EU is playing concretely the card, and not only generally concerning about the situation, generally concerned about the situation, the more they pay this card. If you want a kind of bargaining, the more it can be helpful, I think. But no magic tools, no magic tools, and no quick fix. Mm-hmm. So if we want to be realistic, then we have to add that as well.
We had a couple more questions. I'd like to collect all the remaining questions, and then you can choose which ones you want to answer and neglect the others.
No, I will answer all.
I think in the back, and also Debbie. Go ahead.
the election, is that an episode that could turn the cold civil war, what you call in something warmer? So what do they do in that case?
Very good, thank you.
Maybe we'll collect Debbie's question as well. Go ahead.
Great, thank you. This is super great. I'm going to ask you a bigger question about how Transparency International is sort of thinking about its work in situations you're describing the media capture in Hungary. If I were sort of thinking about how people might characterize media capture in the U.S., they might sort of look at the internet as being a bigger problem, although certainly there are problems in other areas as well. And it wasn't, it's not as much by state, but by, particular party. And even though states are operating in different ways in different parts of the world, it's like, who's going to do the sanctions kind of depend on who falls on which side of media freedom at this particular point. And so I just wonder whether Transparency International is thinking about like how to deal with these situations where there's kind of this cold civil war, I love that term, in many countries, and the role of information is playing such a role, plummeting. People really feel like they, in this country, live in very different worlds depending on what kinds of information sources they have. So I was just curious about, kind of forward-looking strategies for dealing with this situation when it's not as clear that country falls on one side or another, as different elements within different societies are
So kind of overcoming this polarization, that's what you mean. Oh, very good question, thank you.
Right, you can answer.
Okay. Well, all the three questions are extremely good, so let me take them. So first one, the rhetorics about communism. So the rhetorics about communism is quite clear. It's very strongly anti-communist. So it's not. It's in this sense, it's not at all the Russian case because Putin uses the communist parts as the former Russian Grace and whatever. That is not at all in Hungary. So Orbán's and Fidesz communication on communism is entirely anti-communist. But that's the rhetoric. In Hungary, you have to see always behind the facade. When it comes to reality, we can say that there is and there have been lots of measures and even policies which have the reminiscence from the communist times. So, for example, that in economic terms they sacrifice the fate of the younger generations and of the future generations for the current well-being and for the current increase, however it's not extremely big increase, but still increase of standard of living. That's exactly what happened under the mild communism, what we had in Hungary, under the Kádár regime. This extreme centralization, it's also has a kind of reference to communism. The extreme and very, sorry to say, but very annoying anti-Western communication and sometimes very common anti-capitalistic communication. In brackets, despite this communication, lots of multinationals get on very well with the regime, but that's another story. But this very strong anti-capitalistic, anti-Western communication, it has reference to the communist regimes. And last but not least, from corruption point of view, to use the state assets for my private profit. This has been going on in communist times. Paradoxically enough, in the 80s, it was a kind of progressive thing in the communist regime back then, that they introduced the scheme within state-owned enterprises that people could do their own business within the state-owned enterprises when the costs were covered by the state and the profit went to the persons. Back then, inside the communist setup, it was perceived by many as a progressive. But of course, it's not a progressive because it's abuse of the public goods, and it is reproduced now in a much larger scale now. So basically, this blurring of boundaries between the public and private, between the state and the market, it has reference to the late, not the early communism, because that was much more repressive, to the very late of this goulash communism, what we had of this mild communism, clear references. So there are very interesting studies, and I wrote also about that. That is really, so there are much more parallels than you would think at first sight, and that you would draw to conclusion from the otherwise anti-communist communication. Second question. What happens is if they lose the elections? Nobody knows, but inside the opposition is quite divided. But I mean not party politically, but the think tanks or the brains inside the opposition or the intellectuals inside the opposition are quite divided on this issue, I have to say, and we can only hope that they can form a common opinion when it is due to. There is one side which says that if there is no constitutional majority, so there is no 2/3 in parliamentary mandates, then basically very limited things can be done. Almost sure that there will be no constitutional majority. So that's almost entire. We can almost exclude this scenario. Why cannot be done? Because lots of laws, including but not restricted to the constitution, are cemented by 2/3 majority. So they constructed some laws which can be modified only by 2/3 majority. So some people in opposition say to speak of a kind of I would say this a formalistic legal approach. They would say that in this case, unfortunately, not much can be done, which I think might be true legally, but cannot be. It's unsustainable politically. You win the election and you do nothing. I mean, that cannot be done. But lots of good lawyers say that. Another bunch of good lawyers say that if that happens, then even with simple majority, even the constitution can be changed, and this laws with 2/3 majority. For example, with the reference of the EU legislation, they argue that as the EU legislation is above the national legislations, so they can change it they can change it with reference. So the logic would be to state that according to in line with the 7th article procedure, that the current Hungarian government breached the rule of law and other norms of the European Union, and based on this principle, these laws and legislations can be changed. It has some truths, but nobody knows whether it can work out or not. I am moderately skeptical about that it can work out, and including that the EU could accept that. If the EU accept, then it's okay. But even if the EU accept, it's not entirely okay. But then, because then half of the population will still think that okay, they modified the constitution with a simple majority. So the Cold Civil War will be strengthened and not reduced. So the Cold Civil War situation. So we might end nowhere with this as well. And the solution, which is the more sympathetic for me, and it was pulled up. We did a very extensive study on state of corruption, which we released which released some weeks ago, and we will have some new releases in Brussels. I will go to Brussels in 2 weeks. It's called Black Book. It's an extensive analysis of corruption situation of the last 4 years. And we asked a very famous Hungarian lawyer, who is, by the way, professor at CEU, András Sajó, who put forward, it is a very well-established study, who put forward a solution which basically, in nutshell, it's of course much complicated than that, but in nutshell, it would say that a kind of reconciliation should be done, a kind of deal, if you want, between the new government and the former government, that the deal would be, in nutshell, to put it very bluntly, that you can keep some positions, the new government would say to the old government, some positions, even in some cases some impunity, in exchange that the institutions can work properly according to kind of rule of law. Even if this can be controversial as well, but that, for me, politically, sounds much more realistic than any of the two would-be solutions. I don't know if it was answered to your question. Yeah. So the third question about how to overcome it, and yeah, so I totally agree what you said. And in these kinds of, to stay impartial or unbiased in these kinds of hybrid regimes, it's an impossible task. So I consider myself, if there was a democracy, a true democracy, then I would consider myself as a neutral person. But I recognized quite swiftly after I joined TI and leading this NGO in this regime, that it cannot be done. So you have to, you cannot keep the same distance from the both sides, but then you risk what you had in your question, that you risk that you communicate only to one part of the society and not to the other part. We had attempts to overcome this extreme polarization with not much success. Sporadically, and in the beginning, when I started this position in 2013, 2014, there were sporadically 1 or 2 occasions when I could give interviews to pro-government outlets. But for many, many years, it's not anymore the case. So I am labeled personally, as well as the organization, as Soros mercenary or whatever. So sometimes even traitor of Hungary or whatever. So it's very hard to overcome that. In which we can nevertheless, or we can try, and we obviously try that. These are, if we don't really speak of corruption, but we speak of transparency and other values. By the way, the business is eager to hear transparency issues as well, rather than corruption. So if we have negotiations with businesses, we should never use word corruption. That's another story, how the business relates to the regime. Very interesting, by the way. But if we speak more of transparency, then it can reach more people. And another thing, which is of course not a miraculous remedy either, but still, of course we do, because we are party politically, obviously independent, that if and when occurs a corruption case inside the opposition, that we uncover that as well, obviously. And there was a case like that after the 2019 local elections, when lots of mayorship was attributed, so was won by opposition candidate. And in one of the districts in Budapest, which is held by which is run by one of the opposition parties, the former Hungarian Socialist Party, the Hungarian Socialist Party, which formerly governed. And we exposed that case as well. And the other thing which was more relevant, let's say 10 years ago or 8 years ago than now, that I and we were always saying that the socialist government was also corrupt, no doubt about it, but in a totally different way, in a much more decentralized corruption. But after 12 years of Fidesz governance, I mean, this is, and after such a extremely centralized and extremely huge transfer of wealth unduly to the government close cronies, I mean, this is a kind of anachronistic to refer all the times that, okay, 12 years ago they were also corrupt, which is, by the way, true, but that doesn't, I mean, it's not so legitimate to bring it up all the time after 12 years. But all in all, it's a very, very different, very, very difficult task, by the way, not only for the NGOs, but also for the independent media, because you might easily fall in two traps. One trap is that if you try to keep the distance, let's say if you are an independent journalist or an independent outfit, if you try to keep the same distance, then you basically legitimize the regime. If you don't keep the same distance, you can be blamed that, okay, you are biased. So I would also say that in a hybrid regime is even more difficult than in a pure dictatorship. Of course, pure dictatorship is much worse than the hybrid regime. Don't misunderstand me. But from this very aspect, is much easier, because in the dictatorship it comes normally that you shouldn't be unbiased. I mean, you take. So it's quite clear that you have to be against the regime. In a hybrid regime, when lots of people do not perceive the authoritarian tendencies or do not care about authoritarian tendencies, even if they are in place, as we see, but lots of people do not care or do not perceive that. It's much harder to say that, okay, we are against regime because of these tendencies. So it's a very difficult task.
Thank you so much, Dr. József Péter Martin, for spending time with us at the University of Denver. I know that Hungary is a relatively small country, some distance from here, but I feel like the Americans can learn a lot from what you've been through and the way that you're trying to combat democratic erosion. It's been so valuable to listen to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the conversation. Thank you very much for the question and for the invitations. And thank you very much to you for the attention and for the very, very, very good question that I received. I really appreciate it. I really enjoyed, and I've been enjoying my time here in Denver.
Thank you.